I know. I didn't realize we were going for 2 hours.
Assalamu alaikum ikrarlık şart Türkistanlık aziz qarindoshlar. Ko'rayotgan dunyo qo'rquvli to'r televiziyasininki naq maydon programmasi aziz qarindoshlar biz sizlarga hozir bu Londondagi Churchill sayil sharida biroz boya o'tkazilgan bu Uyg'ur sud kollegiyasiniki hukm e'lon qilish yig'inininki amaliy ahvolini diqqatingizga taqdim qildik aziz qarindoshlar. Bu yerda tarixiy bir hodisa yuz berdi, tarixiy bir voqea yuz berdi. Millatimiz xayrli olsun. Dunyo qo'rquvlininki tashabbusi bilan va arzi bilan 2020 yili 9-oyda qurilgan Uyg'ur sud kollegiyasi 3 qatim keyin-keyindan isbot anglash yig'ini chaqirish orqali bugun hukmnomasini e'lon qildi va mustabid kommunistik hokimiyatiningki Sharq Turkistonda Uyg'urlarga asos qilgan yerlik xalqqa qarata yurgizayotgan jinoiy qilmishlarninki bu yerda rasmiy irqiy qirg'inchilik ve insoniyatga qarshi jinoyat shakllantirganligini dalil isbotlar orqali isbotlab chiqqanligini rasmiy hukm qildi. Millatimiz xayrli olsun. Ya'ni Uyg'ur sud kollegiyasi rasmiy Xitoyning qilmishlarini irqiy qirg'inchilik va insoniyatga qarshi jinoyat deb hukm chiqardi aziz qarindoshlar. Hammalarga ma'lum hozirgacha 7 davlat, g'arb davlati Uyg'urlarninki yani Uyghur irqiy qirg'inchiligini qabul qilib maxsus qaror qabul qilgandi va chet eldagi butun muhojiratga Uyg'urlarning diqqat e'tibori, chet eldagi kuzatuvchilarning bo'lsin, mayli hatto Xitoy hokimiyatining bo'lsin, butun diqqat e'tibori bugungi bu boya o'tkazilgan Uyg'ur sud kollegiyasining hukm e'lon qilish yig'inida deb bizning bu yuragimiz, og'zimiz qaplashib qoldi aziz qarindoshlar. Haqiqatdan endi qanday bir hukm chiqaradi deb. Chunki bu sud gerçi dunyo qo'rquvlining tashabbusi bilan qurilgan bo'lsa-mu, ammo mustaqil bir sud. Bularning tayinligini yani 9 kishilik bağlash hay'atining tayinligini butunlay xalqaro qonun prinsiplar, xalqaro qonunning tartiblari aziz qarindoshlar. Natijada mana sud o'zining hukmini bugun rasmiy e'lon qildi va bizmo xotirjam bo'lgan bo'ldik aziz qarindoshlar. Bu ya'ni Uyg'ur sud kollegiyasininki bugun chiqargan yani irqiy qirg'inchilik va insoniyatga qarshi jinoyat ishlagan deb Xitoy hukumati ustidan chiqargan bu hukmi buningdan keyin texnik ko'p g'arb davlatlarininki, hukumatlarining, parlamentlarninki Uyg'ur irqiy qirg'inchiligini qabul qilish uchun bir qonuniy asos va dalil bo'ladi. Bugun sudning raisi Jeffrey Nice efendim jami 300 betlikten ortiq bu sudninki hukmnomasini 30-40 betga qisqartib bu yerda bir izoh berish orqali eng oxirida bu yerda o'zi sudninki hukmini e'lon qildi va bu yerda sudda shu 3 qatimlik isbot anglash yig'inida o'tirishgan dalil isbotlar guvohchilarninki bergan guvohliklarini qisqacha bir shariylab o'tdi va bu yerda nihoyatda kuchli dalil isbotlarning borligini bo'lib bu yerda doktor Adrian Zens efendimninki bu yerda 3 qatimlik oqidan 3 qatimlik isbot anglash yig'inida sungan guvohligini eng muhim dalil isbot bu Xitoyninki Uyg'urlarga yurgizayotgan irqiy qirg'inchilik va insoniyatga qarshi jinoyatini isbotlashga yetadi. Qonunning dalil, qonuniy isbot bo'la oladi dedi aziz qarindoshlar va shuning bilan bugun ya'ni esinglarda bo'lsin. Bugun 13-oyninki 9-kuni, tarixiy bir kun. Ya'ni bugun yani Dunyo Uyg'ur qurultiyi ninki reisi Doktor İsa efendimni üstüge teklif qilaylik. Doktor İsa efendimninki siz Bahtiyar efendim Doktor İsa efendimni chaqirsin. Aziz qarindoshlar, ya'ni bütün xalqimiz bu uchun tarixiy ahamiyatli bir kun. 13-oyning 9-kunini herkes unutib qolmaylik va Uyg'ur sud kollegiyasi bugungi hukm e'lon qilish yig'inida mustabid kommunistik Xitoy hokimiyatininki Sharq Turkistonda Uyg'urlarni asos qilgan yerli xalqqa yurgizayotgan jinoiy qilmishlarni rasmiy irqiy qirg'inchilik va insoniyatga qarshi jinoyat deb hukm chiqardi va bu hukmininki izohati qismidami shu hukmga loyiq yetarli dalil isbotninki bu yerda o'ttirga chiqqanligini va buning butunlay qonun asos bo'la oladiganligini izohlab o'tdi aziz qarindoshlar. Sudning hukmnomasida jami 300 bet. Biz aziz qarindoshlar sizlardan o'zini so'raymiz. Bugun bu tarixiy kunda texnik jihatdan yana masala chiqdi. Balkim Xitoyninki hakerlarninki hujumga uchragan bo'lishimiz mumkin. Keyin 3 qatim buzilib ketdi. Bundan teki bir iş yaptı burun bu 27 noyabr ötküzülgen 3. kıtımlık ispat anlaş yığınını naq meydandan beriş yarıyanıdımı hürmet Bahtiyar Efendim'ninki kompüter sistemisi bütünle hakkarlarının hücum uçurap bütünle paylaşalı uçup kalgan. Bugün mü 2-3 kıtım hücum uçurduk ve 3 kıtım bir yerde üzülüp ketdi ve kayıttı ulaşqa mecbur bulduk aziz qarindoshlar. Çünkü bu Churchill House sarayı bu bexatarlikni tutup yani Xitoy hakkarlarininki bugungi naq maydon bu hüküm e'lon qilish yig'ini buzg'unchilik qilishning oldini olish uchun butun bu yerda simlik internet to'g'ridan boshqaga bermagan bizga berishni rad qilgan. Shuning uchun biz vaqtliq bu yerda harakatchan internet bağlantısını qo'llanishga majbur bo'lgandik va bizmi hakkarlarning büyük ehtimolli Xitoy bo'lsa kerak hakkarlarninki hujumidan qutulolmadik inshaalloh. Eng muhimi shu aziz qarindoshlar ikra oldiki bizni qo'llab bergan shu sotni hozir qo'llagan moddiy va ma'naviy jihatdan madad bergan va bugun mana zerikmay terikmay shu ekran oldida o'tirib shu xalqimizning taqdiriga ko'ngil bo'layotgan va bizni ya'ni dunyo huquqiy tor televiziyasini yaqindan qo'llab bergan butun ko'rurmanlarimizga takrar minnatdorligimizni bildiramiz. Aziz qarindoshlar, birozdan keyin dunyo huquqiy bu yerda bir axborot e'lon qilish yig'ini chaqirdi. Ana ko'rdinglar bir sanini ko'rsatayli Baxtiyor efendim. Hammalar tanıştık bo'lgan Uyg'ur xalqininki qadrli do'sti va Angliya parlamentida Uyg'ur irqiy qirg'inchilik qarorining qabul qilinishi uchun favqulodda muhim rol o'ynagan, boshlamchilik rol o'ynagan va bu sababdan Xitoy hukumatining embargosiga uchragan Nusrat parlament a'zosi Nusrat G'ani va bir qancha parlament a'zosi bor aziz qarindoshlar. Bu hozir sotdagi bu yerda dunyo huquqiy tarafidan hozir shu sotning hukmi qarta bir axborot e'lon qilish yig'ini o'tkazildi. Mana ko'rdinglar zalning ichida shu Uyg'urlar sotning eng oxirgi hukmi e'lon qilingandan keyin yana tantana qildi bu yerda ko'zlariga yosh oldi qarindoshlarimiz. Yana bu yerda rasmiy bir xalqaro mustaqil bir sot tarafidan Xitoyning Uyg'urlarga yurgizayotgan irqiy qirg'inchilik rasmiy qonuniy jihatdan bu yerda dalillanib hukm e'lon qilingani uchun bu Uyg'urlar bir tarafdan qayg'ursa bir tarafdan yana bu yerda o'zlari uchrayotgan zulmning bir mustaqil sot tarafidan qabul qilinishi isbotlab chiqilishidan nihoyatda xursand va mamnun bo'lganligini ifoda qildi va Uyg'urlarni qo'llayotgan bu yerda bizning chet ellik ajnabiy qarindoshlarimiz bizni qo'llayotgan do'stlarimizmi bu yerda
when things are prepared here, which will be between 5 and 10 minutes time from now, instead of hearing directly from the tribunal first, you will hear from an assembly of politicians who are here to answer your questions and to deliver a very short statement. So that will be in 5 to 10 minutes time from now. Following that, the tribunal will be back here for their planned press conference. Thank you.
Aziz qarindoshlar, diqqatinglar sot haqidagi sotning hukmi haqidagi axborot e'lon qilish yig'inida bo'lsin. Bu axborot e'lon qilish yig'inini dunyo huquqiy va Angliyaninki yuqori va tuvan palata a'zolarininki birlikda uyushtirish bilan o'tkazilayotgan shu sotning hukmiga qarta o'tkazilayotgan axborot e'lon qilish yig'ini aziz qarindoshlar. Tushdan keyin shu bugun hozir sot e'lon qilgan hukmnoma bir Şarq Türkistonlik shu arzdor tarafidan dunyo huquqiy tashkillashi bilan Xitoyninki Londondagi bosh elchixonasiga yetkazib berildi. Balkim Xitoyning bosh elchixonasi qabul qilmasligi mumkin. Shunda bo'lsa-mu bu hukmnoma Xitoyninki elchixonasiningki xat sandig'iga tashlab qo'yildi va bu yerda norozilik harakati bo'ldi va tushdan keyin Tibetliklar bilan birlashib shu Uyg'ur sot kollegiyasininki chiqargan hukmnomasi munosabati bilan Xitoy elchixonasining oldida ya'ni ertami tushdan keyin maxsus norozilik namoyishi uyushtirildi. Xo'sh Baxtiyor efendim, sizning bir ta'sirotingizni anglaylik. Hayajonmisiz? Qanday bir tuyg'uda mana hukmnomani oldik?
Acayip ciddiylik ichida o'tdi. Buning ustiga bu internetniki to'liq uzilishi bizni ayta jiddiy qildi. Mishada eng oldi bilan biz butun dunyo Uyg'ur qurultayidagi barliq rahbarlar, Uyg'ur adliya arxiv bankining barliq xizmatchilari bizningki jangovar lager shohidlarimiz, sotqa chiqqan barliq shohidlarimiz, bizning barliq Uyg'ur irqiy qirg'inchilik uchun guvohlik bergan akademik tadqiqotchilarimiz, shundaqla o'zini Uyg'ur deb qanday Uyg'urning eqiyotgan o't yurak barliq Uyg'ur qarindoshlarimizni qizg'in tabriklaymiz. Oxiri Uyg'ur irqiy qirg'inchiligi deb dunyoda bir tunji qatim sotning hukmi chiqdi. Bu odamni nihoyat hayajon qildi. Menimcha shu naq maydon ko'rayotgan ya bundan keyin shuni anglaydigan qarindoshlarimizning hammasi nihoyat hayajonda deb o'ylayman. Bir yildan ortiq nurg'un kishilarniki tang hamkorlashish bilan butun Uyg'ur akademikdagi qarindoshlarimiz butun iqtisodiy jihatda, ma'naviy jihatda shu sotning o'ziga yordam qilgan va buningdan boshqa har jihatda bizni qo'llayotgan barliq qarindoshlarimizga chin dilimizdan minnatdorligimizni bildiramiz. Oxiri biz kutgan natija chiqdi. Xudoyim bu ishimizni texnik xayrli qilsin. Xitoyning halokatini tez kunda tezda amalga oshirishga Xudoyim nasib qilsin.
Milletimiz xayrli olsun, hürmetli Bakir efendim. Hazır muhaciret Uygurlar belki nihayeti suyungan bo'lsa kerak, bizning xo'shalligimiz qaraldi o'rtaq bo'ldi deb o'ylaymiz. Hozir aziz qarindoshlar, dunyo Uyg'ur qurultiyi Germaniyaning vazir kengash yuqori va tuvan palata a'zolari, oqsumaklar jamiyatining a'zolari va qurultay London ishxonasi bilan birlashib bu yerda shu sotning hukmi haqida axborot e'lon qilish yig'inini chaqirish oldi turdi. Bugun muxbirlar nihoyat ko'p. Bugun sotning hukmi e'lon qilish yig'inida 10 dan ortiq ajansniki muxbirlar kelibdi. Uyg'ur xalqining samimiy do'sti parlament a'zosi Nusrat G'ani xonim, Dunyo Uyg'ur qurultiyining raisi hurmatli To'lqin Aysa afadim, Oqsumaklar Angliya Oqsumaklar jamiyatining a'zolari, Angliya Dunyo Uyg'ur qurultiyi London ishxonasining direktori Rahima xonim. Diqqatinglar, axborot e'lon qilish yig'ini bo'lsin.
The Uyghur Tribunal has concluded that the government of the People's Republic of China is guilty of committing crimes against humanity and genocide against the Uyghur people. This is a rare moment of accountability for the families of victims and the survivors of the PRC's regime's cruelty. Over the past year, the Tribunal has amassed by far the most comprehensive body of evidence on the Uyghur crisis in existence. Following a rigorous and impartial process, this People's Tribunal of objective professionals, all instructed fully on applying law, have concluded that the PRC is perpetrating genocide. The Tribunal has worked to the highest criminal standards and has proved beyond reasonable doubt. And we want to put on record our thanks to all of those that came forward and provided testimonies. This emphatic decision must now compel the UK government to take action in accordance with its international legal obligations. Under Article 1 of the UN Genocide Convention, which the UK and China are signatories to, states have a duty to prevent genocide by all means possible and punish the perpetrators. And this obligation is triggered the moment a state learns that there's a genocide, which the UK has heard today. Our government now has a duty to engage all statecraft, due diligence, risk assessment, all internal and international toolkits available to ensure we are not aiding or abetting the Uyghur genocide. It was noted by Sir Geoffrey that in April, Parliament made history by recognising unanimously that the treatment of Uyghurs in China is genocide. We were joined by parliaments in Canada, Netherlands and the United States. At that time, the government refused to act. Today, everything has changed. Today, the Uyghur Tribunal has declared that a genocide is taking place, and we are demanding that the UK government makes time for We urge our government to carry out a review of export controls they promised in January. They must put in place sanctions on the architects of this genocide, including Chen Kango. They must put import controls on the products of Uyghur slave labour, and they must acknowledge in public that the Chinese authorities are committing genocide against the Uyghurs and engage with their legal duties to protect the Uyghur people. 51 years ago, the United Kingdom signed up to the UN Genocide Convention designed to ensure that atrocities like these, those that happened during the Second World War, could never again take place. Yet, in the 75 years since the Nuremberg trials, the UK has never succeeded in recognising the genocide while it was ongoing. With today's verdict, we have a chance to put that right. Never again should mean just that, never again. And we implore the government to stand up for the Uyghur people and stand by its UN obligations to prohibit the acts of genocide and to hold those responsible to account and to ensure that we are in no way complicit in this ongoing genocide. I now turn to Sir Edward.
I'm here also as a member of the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, which contains members here, many of whom myself, Lord Orton, and others have all been sanctioned by the Chinese government. We're here as well, and I am also the co-chair of a all-party parliamentary group on Magnitsky sanctions. And yesterday, in anticipation of this result, we called on a list of Chinese officials and a business to be sanctioned under the Magnitsky proposals. And this will be another area that we will be wanting to look at following this report. I completely support what my colleague Musgani said, which is we now need the British government, in the light of this report, to look carefully at this report and then come forward to both the House of Commons and the House of Lords to have a full debate with the government at the dispatch box, explaining what their position will be now with regards to genocide of the Uyghur people. They have failed so far to do that. We now need the government to step up and do that. And all the other issues around the products coming out of Xinjiang now also have to be dealt with in line with what the government previously said they would do but has yet to do. This cannot be trumped. This is the most serious issue that could ever happen in a country to its people. The idea that a country's government would so determine that a particular ethnic group of people were not worthy of living or even living in that country is absolutely clearly genocide when you see what's happened as a result. And so we call upon the British government now to step up, to make those changes, to have that debate, and finally to declare genocide.
I now turn to Lord Alton.
I endorse everything that's been said by Ms. Rakhami and Vice William Duncan Smith. My own interest in this issue goes back many, many years. I visited Western China and I am Vice Chairman of the All-Party Parliamentary Uyghur Group. The evidence that we've heard this morning, as set out by Sir Geoffrey Nice QC and by the Uyghur Tribunal, is truly harrowing. It was shocking to hear about the systematic campaign to obliterate this population, to reduce this population, and to hear this finding of genocide. As Sir Geoffrey made clear, crimes against humanity are proven too in the most appalling cases of torture, rape, the mass movements of people, a million more who are in re-education camps. What are we going to do about this? The Foreign Secretary has herself, as Truss has said, this is a genocide. Well, when words like this are used, it shouldn't be for rhetorical effect or for hyperbole. This is in line, as Sir Geoffrey made clear, with the 1948 Convention on the Crime of Genocide. Genocide has been found. What are we now going to do about that? One practical thing, of course, will be to make clear that there will be a total diplomatic and ministerial boycott of the genocide Olympic Games. The second thing will be to stop companies operating in this country who have direct links to genocide in Xinjiang One example is Hikvision banned in the United States, but not here, and many of us have been calling for it to be banned here. There are many other practical actions which can be taken. It is for the government now to come forward with those, and I agree with Surian that there should now be a full-scale debate in both houses following the finding today, so that parliamentarians are able to say to the government, we expect action now to be taken. I make one final point, which is that during the Trade Act, I moved an amendment in the House of Lords, which went to the House of Commons, and by a whisker failed to incorporate it in that act. It would have empowered the High Court of England and Wales to do the job that has fallen on Sir Geoffrey Nice-Concey and this independent Uyghur tribunal to do. It should not have been left to them. They have been extraordinary in their diligence. They've been magnificent in the way that they have courageously gone about this work. But it should not have been left to them. It is the duty of governments who say it is a matter for courts to determine whether a genocide has occurred or not, to make sure that such a route is open. That route is not there at the present time. That is still the major defect this government and all governments have to address.
We have with us on the stage Rushan Abbas, Rahima Mahmoud, and Dulcan Issa from the World Uyghur Congress. I think Dulcan will say a few words and then we'll filter questions from the floor. Dulcan?
Thank you. I, on behalf of the Uyghur community around the world, welcomes with great encouragement the final judgment of the Uyghur Tribunal, which announced today that Chinese Communist government atrocity crime against the Uyghurs and the other peoples of Turkestan amount to genocide and a crime against humanity. This is the historical day for the Uyghur people. We can only hope that the world takes meaningful steps to end the genocide, crime against humanity, and the torture. That the apparatus Chinese Communist Party is held responsible for such as atrocity.
If you want to ask a question, please raise your hand and tell me which media organisation you're representing. Yes.
DGL, you mentioned the diplomatic boycott of the organization. Do we now be seeking full sorting work on again as well?
I will let Sir Smith lead on that. We have been talking about a full diplomatic boycott, but we want to make sure that the term diplomatic is fully understood, don't we?
Yes, yesterday in answer to a question, the Prime Minister appeared to agree that there would be a full diplomatic boycott of the Olympic Games. That means, by the way, so that we can define it, means no government minister, no government official, including foreign office officials such as ambassadors, etc. That means nobody in an official capacity relevant to government can or should attend. Anyway, interestingly, the Chinese then reacted by saying they never invited them in the first place. So it looks like they've also made us a diplomatic boycotting country. But the main point is, you are asking about sporting boycotts. Now, I take a very simple view of this. I leave it up to individuals. Each sportsman or woman that takes part in the Olympics will have to make that decision for themselves. I've already spoken to the British Olympic Committee, and I said, you should now take a position to condemn what's going on in China, but your individual athletes can make their decision alone. And I hope that they will look at what's going on in China and ask themselves a very simple question. Is it worth it? Worth it to endorse by giving them that publicity at the moment to endorse the terrible abuse that's taking place by the Chinese government.
Next question. Yes, please. For which news? So the question, if no one else can hear it, was about Hikvision, about supply chain transparency in procurement. I assume that was the point of the question. Well, the Business Select Committee, which I wrote a paper for on supply chains, asked for a review of which services we were using and whether they were making our infrastructure vulnerable to the Chinese state. But I'll let Lord Alton respond to the Hikvision question.
And I support what Ms. Ratcliffe just said about supply chain transparency, and indeed I have provided members' bill seeks to amend the Modern Slavery Act in order to introduce much more coherence in the way that we deal with supply chains. I would like to see type marks on products telling us not made in the PRC or made in China, but I would like to see type marks that can guarantee that nothing within the supply chain can be attributed back to slave labour in Xinjiang. So that's on the first point. The second point, specifically about inclusion, is I moved an amendment to the Telecommunications Act so that where in another jurisdiction of a Five Eyes country, I was thinking particularly here of the United States, had banned a company on the grounds of evidence of illegitimacy of its involvement in the surveillance state in Xinjiang, then we would be required to review their status in the United Kingdom as well. That was not passed, but I still believe it would be the right thing to do. Ministers said that they were with it in spirit. We should now be with it in practice and should be reviewing companies like Hikvision who are directly linked to the surveillance state. The controls that we've heard about today that have been imposed there, as you said in your question, are to be found on every high street pretty well in this country as well. Data collection is something we should be very, very concerned about.
We've also been joined on the stage by Baroness Helena Kennedy, and she's also one of our parliamentary colleagues that was sanctioned by the Chinese Communist Party. So what is your question?
Tribunals coming up. Now I see such high-profile figures here, which helps with raising awareness. My question is that, are you interested in our tribunal? Do you know about it, and will you be there?
I'm sorry, sir. This morning we're fundamentally focused on the Uyghur Tribunal and the announcement made by Sir Geoffrey this morning. If you want to refocus your question, I can return to you.
Okay, my question is that now, I mentioned the Awan Tribunal, but the result of this tribunal, that the judgment says that beyond reasonable doubt, the Chinese government is condemned of torture, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Now, what's the process from here? How are you going to go forward? How is it going to turn into, for example, a government condemnation or even law or sanctions against China?
So I mentioned a list of things that we've asked our government to do to respond to the UN obligations and to ensure that we're not complicit. Looking at our supply chains, looking at procurement, and calling out the evidence that was stated today by Sir Geoffrey, but I'll let Sir Ed add to that.
Well, actually, I was just looking here to get back to the list of the people who we call sanctioned under Magnitsky. I've just been looking at the list for the full sanctioning under Magnitsky, which we held in a debate yesterday. I'm going to just read it out. It's about 3 or 4 people. This is number one, what the British government could now do, which is to go forward with these individuals and sanction them. The first is Chen Guangbo, which you've already heard about, but he's known as the architect of the appalling genocide that's taking place now in Xinjiang. He was also, by the way, for those who may not know this, the architect of the suppression of the Tibetan peoples and the destruction of their culture and their nature and the fact that they're going into what is known as labour camps. And I make a simple point here. We no longer call these labour camps. We call them what they are, concentration camps. It's high time we got this term right, because labour camps gives people a sense that somehow there's something possibly okay about them. These are concentration camps that we learned the hard lesson about during the course of the last war. So some other names that are on that list as well, and I'm just reading them out to you now. The Xinjiang Production Construction Corps. That has to now be on it. It is a paramilitary organisation. Pang Jiaru and Sun Jinlong both worked in the Xinjiang area, and they held senior positions and were responsible. And the final name is for Li Yu, as the former party secretary of Xinjiang Public Security. The British government should now put Magnitsky sanctions on these immediately. It should hold that immediate debate about what to do with regards to declaring a genocide, and the British government should step up and give its opinion clearly, honestly and openly now.
I know that Duncan and Fatima have to do another interview. I'm just going to quickly come to Baroness Helena Kennedy to wrap this up for us. Thank you.
Let me start by saying that this was a very distinguished panel led by Sir Geoffrey Nice, who is one of the world's really most esteemed lawyers. really experienced in the field that we're talking about here today, in assessing evidence, looking at the standard as to which you must reach in order to be convinced of the seriousness and the gravity of the allegations that he was dealing with his panel. I really want the nation to listen to this. We have a duty under the convention to prevent genocide, not to wait until it's over. And that's why our government has to act. And I want to echo what Ian Duncan-Smith has just said as my co-chair of IPAC. We really have to have our government take a stand on this. The evidence is clear. The evidence is absolutely there for anyone to see the gravity of what is being alleged here. And I really urge everybody who's concerned with justice in the world, concerned about the ways in which we do our business with the world, it's really imperative that we call upon our government to act now.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I apologise, I can't take any more questions. Thank you so much.
Kılıp 70'ten artık guvachi bevosita şahit bevosita guvohlik berdi ve bu jarayonda sotga bevosita arz sunganlarning soni 500dan ortiq ve sotninki 9 kishilik baholash hayiti bilan sot taklif qilgan 30dan ortiq tadqiqotchi mutaxassis mushu sot topshirib olgan necha 10 ming betlik yozma arzni qayta mushu qisqagina vaqt ichida qayta buni qonun asoslar bo'yicha qonun tartiblar bo'yicha dalillab bugun o'zining hukmini e'lon qildi ve mustabid kommunist Xitoy hokimiyatiningki Sharq Turkistonda Uyg'urlarni asos qilgan yerlik xalq yurgizayotgan jinoiy qilmishlarininki rasmiy qonuniy tartiblar bo'yicha qonun dalillarga asoslangan vaqtida buning irqiy qirg'inchilik ve insoniyatga qarshi jinoyat shakllantirganligini qonuniy asoslar bo'yicha buni isbotlab chiqqanligini butun dunyoga jakaladi aziz qarindoshlar ve bugün bütün dünyanın BBC olsun dünyanın en dağlık agentliklerinin hemmesi bir yerde de bunun kayınlı bulup bu şu sot hüküm elan kılışığından killa bir yerde Dünya Uyg'ur qurultiyi Muşul Sotining hükümiga qarata bir axborot e'lon qilish yig'ini o'tkazdi naq maydonda va bu axborot e'lon qilish yig'iniga Uyg'ur xalqining qadrli va samimiy do'sti, hammanglar tanishib bo'lgan Angliya parlamentining a'zosi Nusrat G'ani xonim bu axborot e'lon qilish yig'iniga riyosatchilik qildi va ba'zi parlament a'zolari va axborot e'lon qilish yig'inida va Angliya Oqsumaklar jamiyatining bir qism a'zolari va bugun Uyg'urlarmi, ya'ni Angliyada yashayotgan Uyg'ur qarindoshlarimiz nihoyat ko'p kelibdi. Yahudi jamoatininki vakillari bor. Ba'zi Yahudi do'stlarimiz maxsus beshiga Uyg'urning do'ppisini kiyib kelibdi.
Tuvanda Uyg'ur sotininki sotchilari muxbirlarni kutilish yig'inini davomlashtirdi ekan.
Diqqatinglar Uyg'ur sot kollegiyasiniki shu eng oxirgi muxbirlarni kutilish yig'inining amaliy ahvolida bo'lsin. Sotninki raisi Jeffrey Nice efendim ko'rdinglar.
From France. Did any of you receive any sweet intimidation before this verdict?
No.
Nothing at all. No pressure.
No, I mean, we were sanctioned, but that was all. And I explained only in short form how the sanctions actually had very limited effect. There was one way it had an effect, which was slightly unfortunate, and that is that Council's team was to have had a woman lawyer as a member of it, and unfortunately the sanctions, not on her, for associated reasons, made that impossible. So that was unfortunate. We lost our two first choice, very senior lawyers who had done things in their own way. We lost that. That was all. Of course, there have been plenty of ad hominem attacks on us. We don't even bother to read them. Why should we?
I'll just go over one point that you made during your reading earlier, was that it's the tribunal's conclusion that everyone in the top levels of the Chinese government, including the president, was fully knowledgeable of what was going on and thereby fully sanctioned what was going on.
Why doesn't Mr. Vetch answer that? He's familiar with the material design.
Yes, as Sir Jeffrey said in his statement, we had a significant amount of evidence linking, by means of policy, speeches, visits to the area by President Xi and other senior officials in both the party and the government. And that was then underwritten and reinforced, if you like, by the leaked papers, commonly known as the Xinjiang papers, where we can make a direct link to policies, strategies, and the implementation of those to the most senior people in the government, including the presidency.
Sir Jeffrey, you mentioned the failings of governments and bodies such as the UN to make such a determination, and this has fallen to the tribunal to do so. Why do you think it is that such bodies have neglected in that responsibility?
Maybe my colleagues have other observations to make, as I get a bit close to this, and you've now heard from the politicians in Duncan Smith in particular. So my perception is that countries don't like being, governments of countries don't like to be compelled to do things, even by the highest moral or ethical imperative. And it's worth noting that the Genocide Convention was not something that the United Kingdom wanted in 1948. It reluctantly signed up. It didn't ratify it until 1970. Likewise, America didn't sign up until later on, the 1970s, in China. And they don't like being told to do, even when there's an absolutely irresistible imperative. And I don't know whether somebody, for all the time that Ursula was speaking, but last year and this year, there was an effort by Lord Alton to introduce an amendment to the trade bill that was going through Parliament. have said it was improper or wrong. You couldn't make a trade deal with a genocidal country. And the government put an enormous amount of effort and resources into stopping that amendment. And it's distressing to read. And from the point of view of the Uyghurs, for example, not wishing to diminish our abilities, but if that amount of effort by a government department had been put into the work we've done, this result could have been achieved more swiftly. But my friends who come, one of the great advantages of this tribunal is that I have colleagues from all different parts of English society in a way, because they have different disciplines. Maybe some of them would like to answer that.
Thank you. I wouldn't claim great expertise in the area of why governments do or don't do things, but there is obviously one can look at the record over many years, and actually the record of the countries avoiding findings and descriptions of other countries as commissions of genocide, precisely because of what Jeffrey was talking about, the obligations under the convention to do something about it. I think that when one is addressing powerful countries in the world, then smaller countries feel reluctant to address it, I suppose, partly because of fear of what the consequences will be, and partly because unless it can be coordinated with more powerful nations through the UN, which at the moment is obviously blocked by the fact that the Security Council has people on it who are not interested in proceeding. Not interested in Syria means that the UN is actually unable to do anything about it. And so the tribunal became necessary to fill that void and to fulfill a mission of informing people what was going on, what is going on, the broad parameters of which have been well known for some time, at least going back 5 to 10 years when these policies in Xinjiang were intensified.
So Jeffrey, hi, Sylvia from the Assistants. Several legislatures around the world have declared genocide, and so has the US government. And your ruling is not the first and will add to that body. How confident are you, though, that it will make a difference to Chinese policy and how the British government handles this very thorny question? I mean, does it? I mean, as an independent body, would the Chinese government take this seriously at all, or brush it aside?
It's a very interesting question. As a matter of detail, that's what 6 parliaments. It was actually the United States government itself, because it was the Secretary of State. So there's quite a difference. And the point that was made in the judgment on one stage is it's quite interesting that all these parliaments, 6 of them, have said it. The English Parliament said it without opposition. It was a unanimous vote, and the government still did nothing. The United States is a government that has said it, and it's still done nothing. So that's a bit of a problem. It seems to me that, first of all, we as a tribunal had no idea what effect there will be. We limit ourselves to providing an answer and hoping that use will be made of it. Perhaps I'll come back to that. But experience shows that this sort of process can happen, so that you can have reports that don't get anywhere technically or formally. The best known one, which is reported at a higher level than ours, that's Justice Kirby's report for the UNH, the Human Rights Commission on North Korea, which has been stalled in the United Nations. So it's got nowhere, it's done nothing. You could say nothing's happened. But if you talk to people on the ground, the fact that his statements, which were very powerful in that report, may well have affected the government of North Korea. But North Korea is never going to say as much. So sometimes it will have effect, and such things will have effect. In also you never know. Then the second way that I suppose these things may have effect is that yes, they may drive governments to act because they just feel they can no longer live without the answer to the question. The third way, I've forgotten what it is, but it looks as though one of my friends wants to give an observation.
I think it's really important to answer.
Yeah, thank you. Where our decision, our judgment, our conclusion differs from others is that we come to this through the evidence. That evidence is freely available for all the public to see for themselves and gauge for themselves. So it's a kind of sharing event in a way. It's taken ages, 1.5 years, and we needed time and energy to do that. There's a lot of time and energy invested in this. Not everyone has that. So in that sense, this is a unique phenomena, if you can call it that. The second thing is that we're, as Jeffrey said, governments didn't rise up to the task, and therefore it's left to people like us to do it. So it's generated by people and is adding to people's momentum, which is already happening.
I would like to add to that this body of evidence is there, and in a democracy like ours, I would throw back to you, the press, and say that you can actually help disseminate this and really make this evidence base very much available to the public to share it, because not everybody will go to the website and read it, but they will follow your news items and an evidence-based argument that you can put forward, I think, as journalists, may have a bigger impact than we could possibly imagine.
Cochrane Coda story. Have you seen evidence that the witnesses who have come forward have been subjected to any kind of transnational repression from the Chinese state? And in light of the judgment today, will the tribunal be supporting the witnesses in any way in the coming months?
It's another interesting question. Mr. Hamid Sabi, who's sitting here as counsel to the tribunal, can't see the bench if he's got anything to say, because we operated a system of some separation of functions in order to ensure that there was independence of the evidence gathering or collection process in the tribunal. Mr. Bench and I tended to walk across from one to the other, but now the positions of ours we know, because we were sometimes shielded from problems, is that there was definitely some intervention with witnesses, and perhaps Mr. Sabi will be able to tell us a bit more about that. That is direct interference. There's also another feature which I don't want to highlight, but I think is worth mentioning. When you find yourself involved with, as we were, of course, an activist group, the World Legal Congress, you've obviously got to be cautious about whether they're going to be acting independently and they're not going to be interfering with the witnesses or anything like that. They were absolutely impeccable. From start to finish, all the people working with them were just like an independent process of getting evidence for us. But sometimes you find yourself getting, or Mr. Sabi found himself getting closer to other organizations. And one of the sadnesses of the civil society world is that organizations that should be aligned sometimes become competitive amongst themselves, and that can sometimes operate as an impediment to getting at the best evidence. What we had to ensure was that the witnesses coming to us, were as free and as willing to give evidence as possible. We did so. But that other little problem is a recurring one. If only all organizations pursuing particular interest groups, let's not focus on leaders, there are many others, the more they can cooperate and not feel possessive about their evidence, the better. See what Mr. Savi's got to say.
Thank you. The witnesses, of course, were attacked and harassed by the Chinese government in press conferences that the Chinese government organized. They brought the thing by force their relatives to give evidence against them, to denounce them, to call them liars. And they have continued to harass them, even when they are outside China. As near as 2 weeks ago, I was speaking to one of the witnesses who refused to testify because of the pressure that the Chinese government had put on her parents. She was so fearful that she didn't come to give evidence, and very important evidence, I must say, against the Chinese government. And they have continued to harass her with different means and putting a lot of pressure. The witnesses who are outside China are always fearful because if they are in a country that is close to China, there is always a threat, as you heard from the judgment today, that they may be abducted and returned to China. So that remains to be a problem. I hope the Chinese government would now have the courage to stand up and say they will not continue with this practice, and the witnesses are protected from further harassment.
We've had a virtual question in from the South China Morning Post. Given that the Chinese authorities refuse to participate in the tribunal, they could attack the finding as one-sided. How does the tribunal account for this?
Was the last part, who can counteract this suggestion as one-sided?
Yeah, how do you account for this?
Account for the fact they wouldn't take part, or account for the fact that our judgment is not one-sided.
Do you think the tribunal is one-sided because
This is a very interesting and common, and understandably an interesting question. First of all, obviously we had to do everything we could to get China to participate. So we wrote to them at every point, besides Mr. Sabi wrote to them at every opportunity, inviting them to take part. Notified them of all hearings and so on. You have to send it by letter because they have no other way of communicating. They won't let you get it by email or phone. So you do that. When they decline to take part, you mustn't hold it against them, as you heard me say twice in the judgment. Then what do you do? Well, you do what anybody does when a preferred piece of evidence isn't available. You make sure you find the best other evidence to reach whatever conclusion you can. You don't cut corners, and you try and raise issues that might have been raised by the PRC. Now, if you were here during the evidence hearings, there were a number of witnesses for whom PRC had made public complaints, sometimes just general, and sometimes in detail. Always got them to deal with them. And you heard me say of two witnesses, one fact witness, a really potentially very important fact witness, who we had no reason to disbelieve, but simply because it hadn't been possible for the PRC had chosen to investigate or consider his evidence when they might have done, we decided we shouldn't act on it. So there are many ways in which you can be fair. And you know, if you think about domestic criminal trials, for example, it's often the case that there's no participation or involvement by an involved or concerned party in murder trials. The victims very rarely participate, for example, but you nevertheless manage to find out what happened. And often, for other reasons, parties don't take part. So it's an interesting question. You have to be alive to the problem, and you then do everything you can to counteract it. It's not a difficulty to deal with it. Anybody else want to say that? Yes, please, Bobby.
Thank you very much. I entirely agree with you. It's always very difficult to come across a balanced argument from both sides. But I think we did our utmost to make sure that all the evidence we did get was triangulated from several sides and several ways. So I hope we got to the right conclusion. And as Jeffrey said, we also tried to think what PRC might have asked from their side and tried to sort of answer that as well. I think you would have heard Sir Jeffrey earlier on who said that. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm Jane Morrell from Pension News. So Jeffrey, I noticed that you mentioned about governments avoiding doing things out of fear. So I wondered if you had any examples of evidence that showed what was causing this fear, mainly some external factors, maybe from the Chinese Communist Party.
Well, obviously, fear comes in many forms, and I'm not suggesting the governments weren't doing it because they fear physical fear for themselves. Most likely fear governments experience when confronted with difficult decisions of this kind is what might happen to trade, sometimes what might happen to important international relationships, what might happen to their voters' support. You can imagine a government, let's not say that it's the United Kingdom government, personally, but if you can conceive of a government confronted with a genocide convention duty, knowing that there was fairly fierce measures that it could and morally, ethically, legally should take to stop the alleged genocide happening, continuing to happen in vengeance. So really serious trade consequences which would be felt by its people. Then the government would start fearing loss of its voters' base. Now, that's exactly the sort of thing that can operate in governments, and that raises really big questions. Are we humans, a single family? Do we actually have a duty to look after ourselves? As by my observations about citizen to citizen duty, I suggest that maybe we do. Governments don't like that, because they are, especially democracies, determined to be re-elected to keep their voter base cheerful. So those are among the sorts of fears that I think governments have. And what was particularly striking for Mr. Savvy, Mr. Vetch, and me, is we were all associated with the China tribunal, the previous tribunal, the looked at the forced organ harvesting. Now, at that stage, China was still everybody's best friend. And so there was absolutely nothing that the government would say explicitly favourable to what we were doing. And you could say there must have been a reason for that, because the evidence was overwhelming, and that they were fearful of something. What's been rather interesting is that through no desire of ours, we suddenly found ourselves at the beginning of this year, after the end of last year, when we had already started work, there was suddenly a big following wind of support for anti-PRC, pro-Uyghur activity that can affect us. What is it affecting government? It's something that had been stopping them doing something before. But changed. A fear, whatever it was, had disappeared.
Yes.
So one aspect of this question too goes back to what Jeffrey was saying about the support which the tribunal didn't get from governments despite requests. And the similar question, I think, applies to those governments, including the UK government. Why did it not provide evidence which, despite many requests which were made, why did the US government not provide evidence to us despite the express finding of genocide, as Jeffrey said, unexplained, unsupported by any evidence, just simply a statement that China was committing genocide in Xinjiang. And I think that is just as difficult a question to answer as the reason why people take no action under the Genocide Convention, or more generally, rules on international cooperation, genocide and other crimes, international law.
Are we done? Are there somebody in the hall? That's allowed? We can't hardly be a democracy without allowing someone in the hall.
Rabia Khan, member of the public. Thank you for today and for all of your work. I have seen the report has been published online, and I will be reading it after this session. Looking forward to spending a bit more time pondering the findings. My question to the panel is about Chinese investment into UK universities, and particularly educational institutes. So there's a lot of Chinese investment coming into UK universities for various reasons. In light of today's judgment, what would you say to those universities? Do you think today's judgment should have a bearing on the decisions to accept investment, to accept projects, ties? What influence should it have on relationships?
Thank you. I've got 3 professorial colleagues. One other has not been able to attend today, so they're going to have a view, which I will, of course, let them explain. If any of them is not able to explain, they may, of course, have their own internal concerns about not answering the question. But the question, and I'm not going to answer the question specifically, but I can see that Professor Kaur is dying to, so I'm going to get into it in a second. But it is clearly the case that amongst people who have to make decisions when this kind of information comes up are universities, both because of campuses they set up in other countries and because of the dependence there is in this country on funding. And there are amongst many institutions that have to consider that. It was lightly touched on in the judgment, but in the previous judgment, you'll see that it was spelled out a little more specifically. And it said that all those bodies, including academic institutions, had to decide, to the extent revealed in that judgment, how they should react with a criminal statement, to the extent criminality was shown. Before Professor Kaur speaks, I would simply say that there no doubt can be balanced decisions. It's all very well for us to be completely moral and want everything to be completely easy, just do this and never do that. Somebody was asking me about this earlier. Maybe governments haven't any choice but to do nothing when a genocide occurs. Maybe that they should always say to their voters and the public, genocide is happening, for example, and the reason we're not doing this is this. It should be completely open. And it may be that universities tussling with these very serious problems should think that whatever their resolution, they must be clear about what they accept as happening. I don't think I can keep Professor Kaur waiting longer.
Yeah, and I speak from personal capacity. So there's 2 problems. One is that universities are seriously struggling and underfunded. So that's a national issue. That's due to the national government. And as a result, they are open to other kinds of investments. Many of them are coming from China. And so often they're in this tricky position where they have to think of their livelihood, their sustenance, and at the same time they're aware of various issues around taking on such contracts. And there are a fair number of universities in UK and worldwide who are in these kinds of relationships. Plus there's the Confucius Institute, which one needs to also consider. And I think on this matter, one has to, especially the executives, along with the governments in those countries, have to look very seriously at what they're doing and the consequences, especially when it comes to areas like AI and other areas which might be linked to these chain supplies that we and others have identified. So I think there's a serious issue here of a rigorous self-examination and re-evaluation of what universities are doing and need to do.
Thank you very much indeed. Can I just say that some of these students we've had from China have been absolutely superb, and I wouldn't wish to stop that interchange of both research and education across countries. I think in view of what Professor Cause just also said, universities are very underfunded and dependent on a lot of money. But I think, from outside the country, but I think each institution ought to look at this themselves. It is not for us to say where they should go. And also really analyse what is it that they're doing. Do they believe in maybe research and exchange of ideas above humanity? Well, that's up to them. But the important thing, I think, is that we as a world, as a planet, need to go forward. We need to talk to each other. Obviously, this sort of situation is difficult, but I also think that the sins of the government, as well as the personal view, should not be put down to the sins of the people. People do not actually agree with what the government is doing.
Finally, for the triumvirate, Professor Austin.
Thank you. I think I would reiterate the problem of our universities as being severely underfunded. I would also acknowledge how much I've learnt from students and colleagues from around the world. But I think in the end, decisions will be made in universities in one by one, but also according to the pressures that university staff, through their unions, and students feel about these issues. And I'm pretty convinced that decisions that university executives will make will not just be influenced by funding streams, but by the concerns of their own staff and the concerns of their students. I think a lot hangs on those bodies, the trade unions and students' organisations and unions.
I suspect that's about it. Is that about it? One more? Sorry?
We probably have time for one more.
Maybe nobody else wants to ask anything. Ah, there's one at the front there.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the judgment. My name is Moazin Faye. I'm a former Guantanamo prisoner of the United States of America and the outreach director of CAGE. The reason I got involved in getting concerned with the case of the Uyghurs is because 22 of them were held without charge or trial with us in Guantanamo. And one of the things they told me was that they were thankful that they were sent to Guantanamo and not to China. But because of the language of the war on terrorism, and something that you alluded to in your judgment, has given China some cover. To what extent do you think it has exploited that language and has been able to get away with the targeting of Muslims in East Turkestan as extremists and terrorists, if that didn't exist? Thank you.
Thank you. The full answer to that is probably best from not us, but from an academic with a larger view of recent history. Where we've done work on evidence presented to us, we don't pretend to be academic expertise. We can deal with the question, but I'm going to ask first of all Mr. Patrick. No? Anybody else? Oh. Yes, and then I'll come back.
No, I think that the point you make is a very good one. I think that particularly if you go back to the immediate period after 9/11, 20 years or so, in that period, I think that China had an ability to sweep its approach to the Uyghur problem under the global war on terrorism, and it did do that. And in fact, it persuaded the US to join in the categorization of a Uyghur group outside Xinjiang as a terrorist group, and that application of that name lasted, I think, until about 2018 or so. I think as this is, again, just a view, is that I think that reduced that ability to persuade people that their treatment of the Uyghurs was justified as a part of the global war on terrorism has declined, particularly as the treatment of the Uyghurs became more extreme from sort of 2014 onwards. I think people were less willing to accept, and particularly since the evidence of terrorism in a way which perhaps the wider world would understand was extraordinary, limited with every element of violence in Xinjiang and outside being categorized as terrorism. And I think that had an effect at the time. But that's just a view. So academic research.
Thank you for that. Anybody else on this? And the history is particularly well covered in two of the reports I spoke of, the Aspen report, the Australian report, deals with and also to some extent the Holocaust Museum. Nothing else I can say, but thank you for your contribution. And I think that's probably one more.
Sorry for keeping you. I'm Jennifer Bennett from the International Association's Global Insight magazine. And I wondered why you expressed that you felt apprehension, concern about delivering a judgment of genocide on the basis of this prohibited act alone, given that it is part of a convention, as you mentioned, it was written in.
Well, it wasn't possible to be satisfied that the law allowed a disconnect between the precise intention and the act concerned. On the other hand, it was quite clear that if there was, as we found, a precise match between the intention and one of the defined acts, there could be no challenge to that. So as I made clear, without being expressed, there might have been an inclination on the tribunal desire to say perhaps one of the others might have qualified. But in the absence of certainty that a mismatch of intention and act was probably in every way appropriate to find what we did. To spell that out in just a tiny bit more detail, because these are difficult areas for people who haven't spent a quantity of time thinking about these things. If you consider the determination made about measures to prevent births, the intention is to prevent births, to stop children being born. It's very simple. If you look at the next possible category of act, which is transfer of children, transfer of children, what's the expectation? It's not that they're not going to have children. It may be the hope that they will have children with Han and dilute the ethnicity. It's a totally different specific intention. If you go back to the first iteration of the convention, you'll see that the various categories then proposed had sub-category definitions that would have made life much easier. You'd be left without that. And it is very important that our final should be completely secure if it is to be valid. I hope that will do as an answer. And on that note, thank you and farewell.
Assalamu alaikum, ekran oldidagi Sharq Turkistonlik aziz qarindoshlar. Ko'rayotganlar Dunyo Uyg'ur qurultiyi tor televiziyasining naq maydon programmasi. Aziz qarindoshlar, hozir biz sizlarga Uyg'ur sud kollegiyasining hukm e'lon qilish yig'ini o'tkazilgan Londondagi Churchill saroyining naq maydondan bu programmani taqdim qilyapmiz. Aziz qarindoshlar, hammalarga ma'lum bo'lgandek Dünya Uyghur Qurultayı'nın teşebbüs ve arzu bilen 2020 yıl 9. ayda kurulgan Uyghur Sot Kollegiyası mana hazırga kadar kendi 3 qatam isbot almasligini o'tkazdi va bu isbot anglash yig'ini jarayonida Sharq Turkistonlik va chet ellik shohidlardan bo'lib, guvohchilardan bo'lib 70 dan ortiq kishininki guvohligini oldi va bu jarayonda 500 dan ortiq kishininki yozma arzini topshirib oldi va sotning 9 kishilik bağlash aytdi. Sot tarafidan taklif qilingan 30 dan ortiq mutaxassis va advokatlar necha 10 ming betlik yozma arznamani mana qisqa muddat ichida tekshirib, uning qonun asoslari bo'yicha uni aniq qilib, mana bugun hukm e'lon qilish yig'ini o'tkazdi ve Uyghur sot kollegisi Mustafa Komünist Xitoy hokimiyatining Sharq Turkistonda Uyg'urlarni asos qilgan yerlik xalqqa qarata yurgizayotgan qilmishlariningki rasmiy xalqaro o'lcham, xalqaro qonunlar asosida buningki rasmiy irqiy qirg'inchilik va insoniyatga qarshi jinoyat shakllantirilganligini hukm qildi va bu hukmnomasini butun dunyoga e'lon qildi. Aziz qarindoshlar, sotning hukmnomasi 300 necha betlik hukmnoma. Bayan sotning bosh sotchisi Jeffrey Nice efendim deb o'tganidek bu 300 necha betlik hukmnoma bugun sotningki tor betida ham inglizcha ham uyg'urcha e'lon qilindi. Aziz qarindoshlar, chunki bu bugungi program berish jarayonida Rahima Mahmud Hanım, Kurultay London İşgahsının direktörü bu hükümnamenin kısaltılgan nüskasını kısaca sizlerge izahlaştırışken ama kanuni atalgılar boğun için taz yeterlik bo'lmaydi deb o'ylaymiz. Biz buni yana qaytadan program olg'i akilib, uni texnik to'liqlab diqqatingizga taqdim qilishga tirishamiz. Aziz qarindoshlar, bu sotning hukm e'lon qilish yig'inidan keyin daralla Dunyo Uyg'ur qurultayimi uningga ulabla axborot e'lon qilish yig'ini ichib bu sotninki hükümnamasını qarşı aldığını bildirdi ve bu axborot e'lon qilish yig'iniga hammalar tunishlik bo'lgan Uyg'ur xalqining qadrli do'sti Angliya parlamentining a'zosi Nusrat G'ani efendim o'zi bevosita riyosatchilik qildi va Dunyo Uyg'ur qurultayining axborot e'lon qilish yig'inidan keyin mana hozir sizlar ko'rdinglar Uyg'ur sot kollegisininki 9 kishini tarkib topgan bağlash heyeti bu yerda chet el agentliklarininki savollariga, muxbirlarning savollariga javob berdi va sotning qurilish tarixi, sabablari, buning ishga qurilmasi, xizmat funksiyoni haqidagi va boshqa turli savollarga bu yerda javob berib, buni hozir rasmiy aziz qarindoshlar Uyg'ur sot kollegisininki hukm e'lon qilish yig'ini bir tugagan bo'ldi. Bu hukm e'lon qilish yig'inidan keyin biz hammalar tunishib bo'lgan mushu Uyghur sot kollegisininki qurilishi bevosita vasila bo'lgan, uning bevosita tashabbuschisi va bosh arzdori Dunyo Uyg'ur qurultayining raisi hurmatli Dolqin Aysa efendimni mana studiyamizga taklif qildik. Hurmatli Dolqin Aysa efendim, muborak bo'lsin, millatimiz xayrli bo'lsin. Rahmat. Bo'libmi bu Uyghur sot kollegisininki qurilishini siz bevosita 2020 yil 9-oy bevosita siz tashabbus qilgan, sizning tashabbusingiz bilan qurilgan. Mana biz nihoyatda andish ichida turib, bugun mana Xitoyning yurgizayotgan qilmishlarininki irqiy qirg'inchilik va insoniyatga qarshi jinoyat ekanligini qonuniy asosda buni dalillab hukm chiqarib dunyoga e'lon qilgan bo'ldi. Siz bu hukmnomadan keyin nimalarni his qildingiz? Xalqimizga e'lon qanday bir yurak so'z.
Rahmat. Xalqimizning taqozolik bilan kutgan minutlarga shohid bo'ldik. Qaror Xitoy hukumatining Sharq Turkistonda olib borayotgani irqiy qirg'inchilik va insoniyatga qarshi jinoyat. Demak, bu butun dunyoga hammamiz shohid bo'lgandek dünya matbuotlarida tarafsiz bir sud tarafidan bu qaror chiqarildi. Bir yildan ortiq, hatto 1,5 yildan ortiq vaqtdan buyon sudning necha 10 ming bo'yicha materiallarni 500 dan ortiq guvohchilarning guvohligini astoydil tadqiq qilish orqali, mutaxassislarning baholarini astoydil tadqiq qilish orqali jafoliq bir xizmatdan keyin bir sud mahkamasi bugun 300 betlik hükümünü kısaltılgan nüskasını bugün e'lon qildi. Bu tarixiy bir hadise. Bu faqat Sharq Turkiston xalqi uchun, Uyg'ur xalqi uchun tarixiy bir hadise bo'lib qolmay, 21-asrdagi insoniyat uchun bir tarix hadise. Chunki 21-asrda irqiy qirg'inchilik uchrayotgan Uyg'ur bu o'xshash faqat bir qancha xalqlar buningga uchrayotdi. Shuningga bu 21-asrdagi bu yuz berayotgan irqiy qirg'inchilikni to'xtatish uchun xalqaro tarafsiz bir sud mahkamasining qonuniy xalqaro qonunlarga tayangan asoslangan bir hukmi kerak edi. Bu qaror chiqdi. Endi 1948-yili qabul qilgan Birleşken Devletler Teşkilatı'nın irqiy ayrımcılık ahdnomasini icra qilish majburiyatlari Birleşken Devletler Teşkilatı a'zo bo'lgan va mushu ahdnoma qo'l qo'ygan davlatlarning ustiga yuklangan bir vazifa bo'ldi. Demak, hozirgacha ba'zi davlatlar bu bir tarafsız sotning qarori bo'lmay turib bu irqiy qirg'inchilik masalasida amaliy harakat qo'llanolmayganligidan iborat bu faktlarda bu sabablar bilan jim turgan bo'lsa, endi bu davlatlarning bu xil jim turilishiga sabab qolmadi. Demak, artıq dünyanın Şərqi Türkistan'da buluvatkan, Uygurlarga, Kazaklarga buluvatkan bu irqiy qirg'inchilikni to'xtatish, ciddi harakat qilinish, bütün insaniyetning bulup mu Birleşken Devlet Teşkilatı'na bu to'xtamnoma qo'ygan davlatlarning bir mecburiyeti, qonuniy mecburiyeti bo'lib o'tirib chiqdi. Biz aldığımız günlerde işimiz tügemedi. Hem de şu devletlerin şunun kıstaş, Birleşken Devletler Teşkilatı'nı bu halkara kanunu icra kıstaş bizden üstümüzdeki bir mecburiyet. Ben ahırda bu sotka bir yarım yıldan bu yan capalı hizmet kılan bütün kamp şahitlerimizge guvalık bergen, chet ellik mutaxassislarga, bizge iqtisodiy yordam qilgan vatandaşlarımızga, teşkilatlarımızga, şundaqlı bütün tercüme işlerine yardım qilgan, xalisona xizmat qilgan bütün ziyolilarimizga ve şundaqla muşu sotni amalga oshirish uchun kecha kunduz bir sabta bir maqsadda har xil bo'rincha pullarga, har xil shikoyatlarga, har xil tuhmatlarga qarshi ko'krak kirib kelgan dunyo qurultiyining bütün rahbarlariga, sabdoshlarga ve bu sotni qo'llab ekran oldida taqozo bo'lib turgan dunyoning hamma joylaridagi bütün Şərqi Türkistanlıq Uyghur qarindoshlarımga şükranlarımı, rahmetlerimi bildirimen. Ama vazifemiz tügemedi, vazifemiz tek aldığımızda ve kolumuzda pulatdak bir paket var. Hem de devletlerini, insaniyetini, bu kırgınçılıkını, bu insaniyet karşı cinayetini to'xtatish uchun amaliy harakat qilishimiz kerak. Bu bizning oldimizdagi mushaqqatli ve qiyin bir bosqichimiz. Shuningga bütün vatandaşlarimizni bununla çünkü bir kararının çıkışı ayrı mesele. O kararga tayinip durup dünyanın hareket keltiriş bizning üstümüzdeki bir mesele. Ben en ahırda bir yerde demek 2021 yılı 12. ayının 9. günüsü bütün dünya bu kararga şahit oldu. Ben bir dünya politik vakaleten her yılı 12. ayının 9. gününü Uygur irqiy qirg'inchilik xotiri kuni deb e'lon qilaman ve bütün her yılı 12. ayının 9. gününü Uygur irqiy qirg'inchilik xotiri kuni deb mushu jazo lagerida azob chekayotgan, qirg'inchilik uchrayotgan, irqiy qirg'inchilikning zulmiga uchrayotgan Uygur xalqini xotirlash kuni qilib bekitishga chaqiriq qilaman. Her yıl bütün vatandaşlarımızı dünyanın hem yeriki Şərqi Türkistanlıqni bu Uygur irqiy qirg'inchilikni xotirlashga bir milliy majburiyat, vataniy bir majburiyat deb qarashga chaqiraman.
Rahmat To'lqinaysa efendim, aziz ko'rarmanlar, chet ellik Şərqi Türkistanlı aziz qarindoshlar, hozir reisimiz To'lqinaysa efendim deb o'tganidek bugungi bu tarixiy ahamiyatga ega bu tarixiy kunni unutib qolmanglar. 9 dekabr kuni, ya'ni To'lqinaysa efendim bayan e'lon qilganidek 9 dekabr kuni Uyg'ur irqiy qirg'inchilik xotiri kuni deb bugun rasmiy dunyo Uyg'ur qurultiyi tarafidan jakarlandi ve bu kunda biz Xitoyninki Uyg'ur irqiy qirg'inchilikka qarshi faoliyatlarimizni keng darajada qanot yoydirish orqali bu kunni her zaman xotirlaymiz aziz qarindoshlar. Shuning bilan istasimizninki Uyg'ur sud qo'lligisining hukm e'lon qilish bugungi yig'in haqidagi naqbaydan programmamiz bu yerda oxirlashdi. Keyingi qatimliq programmamizni ko'rishaylik. Ko'rishguncha omon bo'linglar. Xayr xo'sh.